Hey, this is Matt Cox, and today's video I'm going to talk about what prior to me going to prison when I first started committing fraud, and it, I'm not really going to talk about when I committed a mortgage fraud as much as when I committed basically kind of like credit card fraud, and kind of how that developed, and and essentially what happened, how I went through the process. But before we get to all that, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, like the video, and share it with your friends, and leave a comment for the algorithm. So I was a mortgage broker. How old was I? Well, I started as a mortgage broker. I was probably 28, 29 years old. And God, things were not going well for me at all. I ended up working for, after college, I worked construction for a while, but then I got my insurance license, and I was an insurance adjuster for a while, and that was a horrible job, and I got laid off one time, and another time I ended up quitting one job. I got laid off from another job, but the truth is, it was just really monotonous, and it was a lot of paperwork, and it was a lot of it was not the job for me. What ended up happening was I started working construction, and then I had a girlfriend that came to me, and she's told me that, look, you got to become a mortgage broker. She was working for a company that was a subprime lender, and they were doing well, or she was doing well. And so she was like, look, you've got to do this. You'd be great at this. So I did. I went and I applied for the job, and I flew out to, I think it was North Carolina. I was trained for 2 or 3 days, and they flew me back, and I started at the mortgage company, and I did really well very quickly. And of course, I did very well very quickly because, like, the very first loan I did, I immediately started committing fraud. It was, I'm not going to get into exactly what happened or how it happened, but essentially the first loan I had, it was going to go under because of like one 30-day late. So I wanted it out, and then next thing you know, next guy that came in, he had an issue. I fixed his issue. Next thing, it just went on, and the entire industry was, extremely, well, there was a lot of corruption going on. Didn't feel like it was that big of a deal. So ultimately, though, like, let's say a year or so later, I ended up owning my own mortgage company. I really honestly didn't even want to own my own mortgage company. I just wanted to be a mortgage broker, but things kept happening that it just ended up, I ended up starting a company. I started a company with maybe 4 or 5 guys, and I would say, and that mortgage company there was a lot of fraud involved in that mortgage company. One of the things that happened at that particular mortgage company was that I remember a woman came in one time. She had applied for a mortgage, and one of my brokers pulled her credit, and he came in, he showed me the credit, and he was like, look, the credit looks great, right? I was like, yeah, credit's great. She had like a car loan. She had a couple credit cards. And so it was great. It was like, okay, it's perfect. She had like, her credit scores were in the mid to high 700s, and she was perfect. She'd been at the same job for 4 or 5 years. Everything was perfect. But when he was putting together the package, he realized that her W-2s had a different Social Security number on them than he had pulled. And he was like, that's weird, right? I forget exactly how he caught that. But so he called her and asked her to come in, and she came in, and she came in my office. Like, he didn't want to have that conversation with her. He was like, I want her to get upset. So she came in my office and sat down. I said, look, we've got a discrepancy here. And she was super nervous. And I showed her I said, this is what we pulled, and this is what you provided, this is what you told my broker on the phone. But here's the W-2 you provided. So I showed her the W-2, and she was like, well, what's wrong with that? And I showed her the discrepancy, and she went, right. And I said, well, what happened? What's the issue? I was like, look, you can tell me. I don't care. I'm not calling the police. I just want to know how you have 2 Social Security numbers. And she was like, well, she had gotten a divorce. And when she told me, so what she said, look, when I got a divorce, I had all this credit in my married name. Her husband had run up all the credit cards and they got a divorce. This is, sorry, she probably, who knows. She said she got a divorce. They had a repo, they had an eviction, and she said that a friend of hers had told her that she should apply for her next property in her maiden name and use her son's social security number. And her son was like 1 year old or 2 years old. So she pulled her credit. She went to the apartment complex and used the son's social security number and her maiden name. And she'd been married for however many years. And because she didn't want to use she was being evicted and she didn't want to use that address. She was like living at her family's house at that point, like her parents' house. So she used the parents' address, she used her her kid's social security number, and she used her maiden name. So the only thing that was really the same with her was her first name, that there was a credit bureau attached, was the first name and the date of birth. Everything else was different. Well, obviously, if her name was, let's say, Janet, there's probably tons of people with the first name Janet and that date of birth. So the credit bureau actually created an alternative credit profile for her. And so now, using her maiden name, which she had credit in, but it was 5 or 10 years earlier. So she pulled her credit using the new SOC, her date of birth, and essentially her new name. And that created a new credit profile. So she got the apartment, and she said after she got the apartment, she applied to get several like car loans or something. And so the salesman, like, she didn't get them. Like the salesman was like, listen, you know, you got to get some credit. You ought to get a secured credit card. So she went out and, using her maiden name, her son's social security number, and the new address, and applied for secured credit cards, which of course she got. She got a few secured credit cards, and after she was like, you know, and after several months, I went back and I applied and got a car loan from like Ford or somebody who at that time I would finance anybody. She made the car payment, she made the secured credit card payments, and then she said after a year or so, she said, I started getting offers from credit card companies that were offering unsecured credit cards. She goes, so I got my money back from the secured credit cards, and I opened up a couple unsecured credit cards. She goes, and now I want to buy a house, and I came in and I applied for a mortgage from you guys, and you guys approved me, only you approved me using my son's social security number. I just remember thinking, you know, I should have been thinking that's horrible, but I remember thinking, wow, that's genius. That is amazing. She had completely created this synthetic identity. And imagine, you can imagine, it was easy for her to go out. She got a driver's license in the name, in her maiden name. It was a real name. So she just switched back to her maiden name. So she's providing this number and borrowing money using this alternative credit profile. So I was like, okay, that makes total sense. And she was like, well, I'm so sorry. Please don't call the police. I was like, oh, what are you talking about? We're going to change your social security number on your W-2s. So we changed it on the W-2s, and the loan went through, and she got a loan. No problem. So, well, at that time, I was already, you know, I had a couple of friends of mine that had gotten in trouble with the FBI. And I remember thinking it might lead to me. I should preface this by saying my mortgage brokerage business had the ability to pull credit. We pulled what's called a tri-merge. I mean, we could pull individual ones. We could pull like just Equifax or Experian, whatever. But we could also pull all three bureaus. So we would pull a tri-merge. So I remember I went out and I grabbed a social security number. I mean, this is horrible. But I went to the file cabinet. I opened the file cabinet. I grabbed a bunch of 1040 forms, and there were people that were taking deductions for their children. Their children's numbers were there, and their social was there. So you got some 2-year-old kid, and I took the kid's social security number, and I went and I pulled the credit, and I made up a name. It was Lee Black. So I made up the name Lee Black. So I made up the Lee Black and used some social security number that I pulled out of the file cabinet, put that on, put a date of birth that was like 7/7/1970, and I pulled it. And it came back, you know, credit profile not found. Okay, That makes sense. I understand there's no credit profile. But I decided, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to apply for some credit cards online. So I applied for some credit cards online, got denied. All of them were denied. Using, of course, the alternative social and name. So using Lee Black's information, I pulled I applied for several credit cards online. All got denied. But then I re-pulled the credit bureau. I went, it was a pain. You had to like recontact who we were pulling from and tell them, look, I need to re-pull this. Can you wipe the credit so I can re-pull it? And they said, well, because typically if you re-pulled it within 30 days, they just give you the same report. So I went back and I re-pulled the credit and they said, okay, we'll re-pull it. So they re-pulled the credit and gave it to me and all the inquiries showed up. But what didn't show up was it didn't say no record found. It now listed Lee Black's name, the social security number I'd given them, the date of birth I'd given them, the address I had given them. And I remember I used the address for what was called they used to be called mailboxes, etc. And I think that the UPS store bought them all out. I could be wrong, but somehow or another they're gone. Some of them are now UPS stores, where they have the mailboxes, the private mailboxes. So I used one of those. And so I got, but all the other thing that showed up on the credit was all the inquiries. So now the name, date of birth, social security number, and address, and all the inquiries showed up. So I now knew I had created a completely synthetic identity. Well, my problem with that was this, that it's like, okay, so you've got the synthetic identity and, how do you utilize that? What's funny is, I owned a mortgage company. At this point, I owned the mortgage company. There had to be 12 guys working for me. Probably 10 or 12 guys working for me at this point, because I'd started with very few, but by this point we'd moved to a bigger office. And I got more and more guys. The small company, the 4 guys ended up being like 6 and then 8 and then 10. It was like, okay, you got to get a bigger space. So I went and got a larger office space. I had like 12 guys working there. I actually had a couple guys working out of their houses just because they didn't want to come in the office. They just wanted to pay a small cut. But how do you make money with a synthetic identity? Was like my question. I was like, well, how am I going to make money doing this? So I decided I was going to get, I was going to go ahead and just, keep paying those, or actually get the secured credit card. Yeah, I thought, you know what, I'll just get the secured credit card. Like I'd always helped clients like build their credit. Like some guy comes in, he gets turned down. You go, well, look, you really ought to think about getting some secured credit cards, this and that. So I went ahead and ordered the secured credit cards. And I remember thinking, like one of the things that I ordered the secured credit cards, but one of the issues was, where do I have them mailed? The address that I provided was a UPS box. There was a mailboxes, etc. box, but it was a UPS box. So here's the issue. Those credit cards have to be mailed somewhere. Where do you get them mailed? I ended up going to the exact mailbox, etc. And, I want to say UPS box. So I'm going to say UPS box. So I went to the UPS box and I got a UPS box. Now, the street address was the same, but I had never put down what the box number or the apartment number is. So I remember I got a box in my own name. I then turned around and I ordered all the cards using that box. Only I didn't put box, I put like number. I just put number, whatever, They always had an issue. If you put like apartment number, they'd have an issue. So I put just like, let's say it was, 1000 Hawk Ranch Road. I wouldn't put apartment 101. I put like number 101. And I printed out the applications. I mailed them off with a money order and boom, 2-3 weeks later, the credit card showed up. I remember walking in that first time and getting that credit card thinking, oh my God, that is amazing. They actually gave me the credit card. So I ended up just making the payments on these cards. I'm just paying and paying and paying. And I remember thinking the credit profile, I remember thinking, well, how am I ultimately going to make money doing this? And what ended up happening was I ended up making several more of these guys. and I'm not going to get into what I was doing with all of them. Like, I might go over that another time or something. Or if anybody's watched, my full interviews, there's tons of interviews on me out on YouTube. So it's not difficult to find what ultimately I did. But I started creating these false profiles. At one point, I had to end up making a driver's license. And what I did was, I remember looking at my driver's license, because the problem is, you've got these credit cards, so how do you really use them? Well, you can buy gas, you can buy stuff over the internet, but at some point you might need to go in to a store. You're gonna have to show your driver's license, and I didn't have a driver's license in the name Lee Black or any of these other guys. So at one point I ended up taking my driver's license, and I looked at it, and I remember scratching off the name. You could actually scratch off your name, and I thought, if I scratch off my name and put another name on it, would they notice? But the problem was, there was a hologram on it, and overlapping all of that, and I was like, oh man, what am I going to do about that? I ended up taking it and really checking out all the security features, and I went to the DMV, and I got an ID. I went and got an ID. I remember, listen, I got an ID, and like 2 weeks later, I went and got another ID. I remember they said, you just got an ID. I was like, I know, my girlfriend threw it out. She was pissed at me, and they were like, all right. So I ended up getting a couple IDs. So I get these IDs, and I went and got like 220 grit sandpaper at Home Depot, and I lightly sanded off my name, but left the hologram. Then I buffed it up. I really kind of made the hologram not so visible, but you could see it. But in certain areas, it was gone, just like it would if you kept your driver's license in your wallet or in your pocket. Those holograms wear down. I took that and I retyped all the information to Word, and I reversed the image. And so I overlaid. I remember I kept printing it out, and I'd overlay it and make sure it was in the same spot, and it wasn't. I'd tap it over one font size, and then I'd shrink the font size to make sure it tapped the right way. And then I had the separation. I kept playing with that, and eventually I got it to where it overlaid perfect. But the problem is, the font was laying on top of the paper. So I got a transparency. I went and bought a transparency, the same stuff like when you were a kid and they would put the transparencies on the projector. I went and bought these thin transparencies. So I got the transparencies, and I then printed the information on the transparency. The problem with that was this. The problem with printing that on the transparencies, now it was easily rubbed off, and you'd hold it up, you could immediately see that it was sitting on the transparency. So then I decided I printed it in reverse. And I went and I ordered this ultra fine transparency paper. And then I started printing all the information on the reverse. So now I have a blank ID, and I would then overlap or overlay the transparency with your name in reverse. But now you're seeing through the transparency into the actual ink. And now the printed, font, the printed information, but now it's correct. It's the correct size. But it's layered between the plastic of my ID and the actual transparency. So I went and I got like a regular glue stick, and I would glue stick. I would take the glue and I put glue on the actual ID, and then I'd overlay it and I'd line it up so that it was perfect. I'd put it in a book, I'd trim it down, put it in a book, wait for it to dry, and then I'd take a razor knife or an X-Acto knife, and I'd cut around the ID. And then I'd take like 220 grit sandpaper, and I'd slightly buff it down so that it was perfect. I mean, I would take my thumbnail, and you'd have to click and click and click and really push to even get in between the two to pull it back off. So it was that fine. You could rub it and everything. It was on there hard. And so I'd made this ID, and you could hold it up and you could look and you could still see the hologram. Now, the hologram didn't exactly go over your new name, but it was in different spots. And if you simply saw the hologram like over my face or over the Florida information, or I'm sorry, the Florida logo and all the other information, it looked perfectly real. So I at some point, now I did this for multiple guys. Like I was constantly going and getting IDs. And back then they would let you. I think they limit you to the amount of IDs. But look, the fact is walking in, giving them an excuse and trying to get the supervisor to sign off on giving you another ID. I mean, that was not difficult because it's me. I got that information. I would get multiple IDs. I'd sand off the information. I'd print out whatever information I wanted. I'd overlay it, and I had a fake ID. And it was a fake ID. You know, I changed the issue number for the drivers, for the Department of Motor Vehicles for Florida, and I would change that number. And there's actually an actual calculation for what that number is. So I had to kind of figure out what that calculation was. It was probably a real person's number for all I know. But I ended up getting that. I remember I made an ID for Lee Black, and I took the ID and I took the credit cards. By this, it had been months. By this point, it had been months and months and months. So I took the ID and I went and I opened a bank account. I mean, you want to talk about being terrified about opening. At this point, I'd opened a bank account. The first time I opened a bank account with a fake ID, I was terrified. But I remember when I opened it for Lee Black, here's what happened. This happened several times because they would pull you up in check systems and there's no record. There's no inquiries. There's nothing. And you're like, okay, I was a guy at that point, I was in my early 30s. So you're a guy in your early 30s and you've never had a bank account. Like, we've never pulled you. Now there's a couple different services. So if you knew the names of the other banks that use the other service, it made sense that, okay, maybe he did go through the other service and that's why we don't have an inquiry. And so they were but they were always iffy. So I remember walking in and they pulled my credit, or they pulled Lee Black's credit. Nothing came up. So of course it's odd. So it wasn't a teller, it was a regular whatever. They called the people that work at the bank, a bank employee. She had pulled my information, so she goes over and she goes, well, hold on a second. She walks over to the manager, and the manager that hands her my ID, and she explains the situation. She glances over at me. She holds up my ID, and she does the whole tilting it back and forth to see the hologram. And she could see the hologram. And I remember thinking, this is an employee of a bank. She knows what to look for. Like, she's going to notice that it's worn down, that it's beat up, that she's going to notice also, but she's going to notice that the hologram doesn't go through my information. And so she looked at it and she goes, looked at the woman she was like, handed her back, whatever she said, oh, this looks fine to me. It's fine. Go ahead. Here. Handed it to her, walked over, the woman put it down, and she started typing, opened up a checking account for me. So now I have a checking account. I have a bank account in the name of this guy using this fake ID. I've got credit cards in his name. I remember what I did then was I turned around and I kept pulling his credit. Well, at some point I pulled his credit. After 6 months, actually, it was exactly 6 months. I was pulling these guys' credit every month just to see like why, because no credit score was showing up. I have 3 credit cards and no credit score showing up, but I didn't understand why. I'm like, what's happening? And back then there wasn't YouTube videos telling you what happens and how it works. There wasn't all this stuff out there. So it's this is trial and error. So I kept waiting. So 6 months went by. And I remember thinking, I can still use this ID. I can still use these guys. Like, I don't have to have credit scores to get a loan. It's just I'm going to get a really horrible loan. Or I could have gone FHA. I would have to make all the documents, but I could cover all that. By this point, I knew I could cover that. By this point, I'm making fake bank accounts. I'm making fake companies. I'm buying shell companies, corporations. I'm putting up. I'm getting business numbers. And you know what's interesting about getting like a business phone number that was registered in the business directory? Because that was like a thing. Like, the underwriters would say, okay, well, this guy's got a business and he has a business phone number, but it has to be listed in the business directory. It had to be listed to an actual house or an actual property that they could call. One time we actually had not once, we had this a few times. I actually had a business line hooked up to an abandoned house. And then we went and forwarded it to another phone number, to a cell phone. So it actually went to a house that was abandoned, but you actually had an address. And you could mail stuff there, and I could actually get the mail. Point is this. Listen, there was all kinds of problems. I remember one time, not one time, why I keep saying one time, this happened all the time. I would get these credit cards, and I would order the credit cards, and I'd have them mailed to, UPS or whatever, mailboxes, etc. And of course, the credit card companies would actually say, they would actually send a letter back saying, hey, listen, we're not going to mail you the card or we can't issue the card because this is like a private mailbox. It's not an actual residence. If we're wrong about this, please provide us a utility bill saying that this is a real address. So I would just go get my utility bill, and I'd change my account number and my name. I'd just glue I'd glue it over. I'd make a copy of it. I'd put the address I wanted for the box, and I'd mail it back to him and say, gee, I don't know what's wrong. I would give him my address, which had my ID, which had that address on it. And I said, that's crazy. This is my address, and here's my utility bill. Bam. They'd immediately mail the card. I just look back on that and I think, you were insane. Like, all the things that I was doing, it was insane. And the thing is, there was nothing out there to show you how to do this. It was just trial and error. Well, at 6 months, I pulled this guy's credit, Lee Black's credit, and he had perfect credit. He had like a 680 or 690 credit score. And back then, that was an amazingly good credit card. Nobody had 800 credit scores. It was outrageous. I owned a mortgage company for, 4 or 5 years. I could tell you there was maybe less than a dozen times I ever saw anybody with over an 800 credit score. Almost never happened. Now, I was dealing in subprime, but I was also an FHA lender and a conventional lender and a VA lender. We're pulling hundreds of credit reports every day, still very seldomly. And now 800 is obtainable. More people have 800 credit scores. You could put anything on somebody's credit back then. Anything. Now you're limited. So now Lee Black has, 600, 700 credit scores, high 600, low 700, because you get 3 bureaus. So like one of them was like 705, one's like 690, one's 695. So they're all basically 700. So he's got 700 credit scores. He's got 3 secured credit cards. I turned around. Now, I obviously bought a bunch of properties in his name. So I applied for more credit cards, unsecured credit cards. And I'm getting credit cards for $4,000, $5,000, $2,000. I went and got like a Home Depot card. It was $1,500. And I turned around and I remember I went and I got, I don't even know if this company still exists. It was American General Finance. So I went to American General and I applied for a personal loan. I called them and I applied over the phone and I got a personal loan, and it was like $7,500. No, it was $5,500, because I remember I turned around and I went to Citi. It was like a Citi Financial, and I got a $7,500 personal loan. And then I went to the bank and I tried to apply. And I remember I was denied at the bank. So I called a couple of banks, and I finally got somebody on the phone who explained to me that the bank actually offered like a $15,000. No, it was like 15 or 12 at the time. It was 15. Like, they offered like a $15,000 personal loan. And they said the underwriting requirements were that you had to have 3 trade lines. You had to have over a 650 credit score. You had to have 3 trade lines. You had to be on your job for over 2 years. Oh, they would lend you double whatever you made in a month. So if you made $7,000, they'd lend you 14 grand. So they would lend you up to 15 though. So if you made 8,000 and doubled it, that's 16,000, but they wouldn't lend you 16. They'd only lend you up to 15. So I just waited. I waited a year. I bought a few properties in this guy's name, made some payments. At that point, I think his credit scores had dropped. I think they were but they were still over 650. They were like, 670, 680. And I remember calling the bank after a year and saying, hey, listen, I want to apply for a personal loan. So I applied for this personal loan with this guy. And so I applied for the loan. I give them all the information. They come back, they go, and I remember I made a pay stub that said he had made like $7,400. So I got a personal loan of $14,800. And I couldn't believe it. I immediately thought, if it works once, it's going to work again. So I called another bank. They did the same thing. I called another bank. They did the same thing. So now I've got essentially three $15,000 loans from this one guy. Plus I had the $7,500 plus the $5,500 plus the credit card. So then I applied for a bunch of credit cards. I got a few credit. Then I started getting denied for the credit cards. Then the next bank I had called, I got denied from them. So I realized that my credit score had dropped dramatically. It wasn't like today where if you go to a car dealership and they pull 10 different, your credit on 10 different banks, within 30 days, they'll consolidate it to one. I mean, here, every single time you pulled it, you got hit. Seven to 10 points came off your score. So very quickly, my score dropped dramatically, and I started getting denied for everything. Well, at that point, I'd also bought a bunch of houses and refinanced those houses. And I had made a few payments. So took all this money out, and I made a few payments, and I let it all go into foreclosure. I made a couple of payments on these loans, and I had a bank account, so I just deposited all the money into the bank account and pulled the money out in cash or in cash slowly. I pulled the money out in cash because I knew at that point if I had pulled out over $10,000, then they were going to fill what's called a CTR, cash transaction report, or they could even file a suspicious activity report. So I was continuously pulling out cash, little here, little there, and I had a debit card, and then I would buy stuff. I just write a check. Nobody's looking for this guy. It's not like it's a stolen identity. It was a completely synthetic identity. So I did that. The whole thing went into foreclosure and went into collections, and I threw away the cell phone, and it was just, that was done. I did that with multiple people, multiple synthetic identities. Used to call them phantom borrowers. Actually, the newspaper really kind of coined that phrase too. They called them, we used to call them investors, really. We used to call them like investors. Well, when they were buying houses, but a lot of them, some of them didn't even buy houses. It was just credit card fraud. And it was synthetic identity. And synthetic identity at that time wasn't even a thing. Like, people didn't even know how that worked. It's extremely prevalent at this point in time. And those security features are up, and banks are on the lookout for it now. So although honestly, it's probably, I'm sure it's still, I mean, not probably, I know it's still happening, obviously, and I've talked to these scammers who are always calling me up, asking me to, hook them up on the game, bro. Like, show me how, like, next time you do that, like, include me, like, I'll go in the bank. Like, they're always calling, they're always emailing me and sending me messages and trying to call me. And I've actually spoken to a couple of these guys on the phone. I actually had a guy who befriended me for like 6 months. Like we were buddies, like, hey, I'm a fan. I saw you on Concrete. And he wanted to talk to me on the phone. And we talked. I was like, okay, what's up? Well, what do you think I should do about this, about that? So, we talked a few times. And then he started texting me all the time. So, you get to be kind of friendly with these guys, So I was kind of friends with him. And he was a pretty cool guy. At one point, he actually flew down from New York to see me. And as soon as he flew down, we went to met at Starbucks, and we weren't talking 4 or 5 minutes before he started asking me if I would basically help him commit a fraud. And it was just like, what? Yeah, man, I want you to, hook me up, bro. Help me out. Help me do this. Help me do that. It was like, well, are you serious? I'm like, I realized right away that was the only reason he had been talking to me, and we were friends and we were cool and everything, was he was trying to get me into a position where he could ask me to help him commit fraud. That's what he wanted. He wanted me to help him commit fraud. And I was like, this is ridiculous. I'm not doing that. It's ridiculous. And the worst thing is that, like, if he had gone out, even with my tutelage, he would have been caught almost immediately. There's no way he would not have gotten caught. And his whole thing was, you know, I wouldn't say anything about you. I wouldn't tell, you know, if they grabbed me, I wouldn't say anything about you, bro. But the truth is it wouldn't matter because my name's in your phone and they run my cell number against mine. They'd see this guy's on probation and they'd say, look, this guy's on probation for exactly what you're doing. We'll cut you loose if you just give him up. That kind of thing. Get him on the phone talking, get him saying this. Of course, he wouldn't have been able to do that, but it wouldn't matter. All they'd have to do is add my name to the indictment. You know, it would be very difficult for me to actually defend myself against something along those lines, something in that vein. The thing is about that synthetic identity is even if you remove the mortgages that I refinanced, because I refinanced all these mortgages and I probably made $500,000, but let's remove that. Let's forget about that money. The credit cards alone were the credit cards and the personal loans. That was over $100,000. It was over $100,000 on a synthetic identity that I created. And, you know, that scam eventually for me evolved into me figuring out how to get Social Security, the Social Security Administration, to issue Social Security numbers to me. You know, I started creating fake birth certificates and shot records, and I would go into Social Security and I'd tell them, look, I have a child that was born, you know, he's 10 months old and he was born with a midwife, wasn't born in the hospital. His Social Security number was never issued. And they would issue me a Social Security number. And I could pick any name I wanted. Let's say, you know, the father's name is, you know, Matthew Cox or whatever. I could say anything. I'd say Lee Black because I have an ID named Lee Black. So, but whatever. Let's say I'd say the father's name would be, let's say, Matthew Cox. The mother's name would be, let's say, Jennifer Silver. And my son's name would be David Silver. The mother, that you don't have to give your son your name. You know, your surname. It could be the mother's surname. So I would walk in and I would give them a birth certificate, and that name could be anything. I just say, oh, well, that's the mother's last name is Silver. So it's David Silver. She named the kid, and that's the way it is, and there's nothing I can do about it. And they never questioned that. They would never question, like, I would get these names issued to people that just, you know, did not exist. And look, a week or two later, the Social Security card would show up, and then I'd register to vote as that person. So I'd register to vote as David Silver. And then I'd go and I'd order the credit cards, everything. Once I had enough documentation, I would walk into I actually started walking into the DMV. Let me tell you about being terrified walking in the DMV the first time. That's terrifying. And I would change the date of birth on the birth certificate. So I changed the date of birth on a fake birth certificate. I'm walking into DMV with a fake birth certificate that says David Silver with a, you know, July 7th, 1970 date of birth, and a Social Security card issued to David Silver. And I would walk in and I'd give them that, oh, and I'd register to vote in that name, and I'd have several credit cards in that name. And I also had the envelopes that were being mailed to me. I would come in, they all had the address. Then I'd also come in with my lease. I'd make a fake lease with that address. So that UPS box or mailboxes, etc. box, that private mailbox now looks like an apartment. Everybody thinks that at the DMV thinks it's an apartment. So they think it's an apartment. They think I'm registered to vote in the state of Florida. I've got a birth certificate. I've got a Social Security card. Everything is real. So they would give me they would immediately say, oh, okay, oh, you know, just moved. Yeah, I moved here a few months ago and I lost my driver's license. And, you know, I'm from, you know, wherever, Kansas or whatever. So they'd say, okay, I'm only asking for an ID. It's not like I'm trying to drive because I got a DUI somewhere. You know, and they would, even if they tried to pull it in Kansas, nothing comes up. That's not my fault. I have all the documentation. So they'd say, go get here. They put it all in the system. They would have me take a picture. They'd give me an ID. I'd walk out. Now I've got a real driver's license. I have a real driver's license, a real Social Security card, real voter's registration card, real credit cards. And you can imagine all the real stuff I ended up having. And after, other than the DMV, who asked you to see your birth certificate? Nobody. Anyway, that's essentially the synthetic identity fraud that I was committing. And then I was doing that. I was always doing that. A little here, a little there. Anyway, if you like the story, do me a favor, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, share the video, and leave a comment. And listen, I appreciate it. Tune in, check it out, tell all your buddies, and see ya.